Today I wanted to do a video on really cheap sort of gas masks, and I don't mean cheap for you to buy, I mean like the countries that making them decided they wanted to assign absolutely no budget whatsoever to making these masks. Now that can actually be quite a good decision, because obviously with logistics, if you can make lots of masks that will protect people for almost no money, that's a really good thing, but that doesn't always mean the user of the mask gets a very good quality controlled mask. So this video is just going to be looking at some masks in my collection that are obviously made on the really cheap. So let's start off with the British World War II civilian mask. I'm sure you're quite familiar with this, but this is like one of the examples of, just how cheap can we make a mask. You have a single piece of celluloid, I'd guess, as the eyepiece. It's put together with 3 straps to attach it to your face. Basically, it's almost like a rubber sock with 3 straps on it, and then the filter just taped to the mask. So it's yeah, really cheap and nasty. Of course, it would have protected your life if you had to use it at the time and the filter was still working, but these things were cheap. As said, it's basically just a rubber sock. The idea being you have the filter at one end, some eyepieces in it, and then you just do the straps up to make it an airtight seal, roughly, on your face. Certainly not a mask you'd want to use if you had access to anything better, but it would have probably done its job. And as I said, this isn't to necessarily criticise things saying, they're not going to work full stop. It's mostly just to say, look how cheaply these were made. So in a similar vein to that mask, we now have the Folkgasmask from Sweden, which is basically designed to do the exact same job. This doesn't look quite as cheap and nasty, but it's still quite interesting in how cheap and nasty it is. Very similar design to the British one. It's got the same 3-point sort of strap system, really. The thing I love with this is it's got safety pins on it as part of the strap mechanism, because, that'll make it cheap. So it's actually, I think, the exact same filter design as the British one. Yeah, it is. That's really interesting. I never noticed that. So the inside, it's got the same filter style, where the actual entire filter has a valve on the filter, so they would manufacture the filters with the valves on, then tape them to the mask. So the mask itself is essentially this piece of rubber, 2 eyepieces. Now I'll hold my breath while I put it on. So, no exhale valve. The mask expands around your face when you breathe out. Not a brilliant design. Known as the Type 32, made by Goldman, I think that says at the top there. But yeah, this was made incredibly, Gulmeren apparently. This was made incredibly cheaply. A bit better quality control on it than the British one, but all the same real design. It's got, just saying, the eyepieces are surprisingly nice on this. I'll give them that these eyepieces are fairly well made, but obviously the mask is super cheap. You've basically got a filter with a valve on it. You tape something that roughly fits somebody's face to it for a mask. When they breathe out, there's no exhale valve. The mask has to expand around your face. So again, you've got this really cheap and nasty design, but of course it would work to a degree if you had to issue it to people. So, yep, the Swedish Type 32 or Folkgasmask, another really cheap, sort of horrible design. Back to Britain with a slightly improved mask. It's the C7 respirator. The only difference between this and the previous British mask is this basically had an exhale valve on. And it's got a slightly more competent strap system, because it's got an additional strap on it, that's about it. Again, this is very similar to that Swedish mask I just showed you. Same kind of sort of filter setup on it. Other than the exhale valve and having 2 separate eyepieces, this is no better really than the previous mask. I'm not going to breathe through it, but yeah, it wouldn't be too uncomfortable to wear, I guess, but it's not going to be brilliant. But again, as I said before with these, the funny thing is, this was made to be super cheap, and then they said, oh wait, no, that's actually too expensive for the civilians. Recall them, recycle them, they can die in a nuclear fire. So this mask was, despite being really cheap to make, too expensive for the government to issue to civilians. But it's still an interesting piece, and now, as I was saying, these are fairly rare, so they were cheap and nasty masks to make at the time, but they're not cheap and nasty to buy now, they're actually quite valuable. But yeah, C7 respirator, another example of a mask made on the super cheap. Now, this weird mummified thing I believe might be a GM54, but all the stamps on it have long since perished, so I have no idea what it actually is. But it can either be a GM30 or a GM54. Now, this was basically, in World War II, the Germans, or before World War II, the Germans made a mask called the GM30, and it was basically, how cheap can we make a gas mask? And rather than making an actual gas mask out of rubber, because Germany didn't have much rubber, they kind of made the mask out of a weird material and then coated it with rubber, which is kind of clever, but it was also a really crap mask. Now, what happened is, if this is a GM54, which I believe it might be, is that West Germany, when they had no money after World War II, wanted to make gas masks again. And they said, what was the cheapest design Germany's ever come up with? Probably that one. Well, actually, no, there was, I think it was the Volksmask 44 or the Volksgasmask 45, which was literally a sackcloth with eyes and a filter intake on it. But yeah, they basically just remade the same mask. This has got a really weird funky smell to it. Not quite sure how to describe it, but this is what you get when you try and make a mask really cheap. I can actually see light coming through the mask because the rubber coating is so thin in places. But yeah, obviously it has not preserved well, even being kept in a tin. The mask material is completely dehydrated. It's like literally a mummified husk of a mask. But yeah, if you're too cheap to even make your mask out of rubber, why not just dip another material in rubber? I'm sure that will be as good as using actual rubber. So there you go. Now, West Germany did make a slightly better mask than this a bit later, which I think was called something like the Civil Mask of 56. It's the creepy white rubber one, which is basically a GM38, but then they've decided they're going to make it out of white rubber. So it was like Civil Protection Mask 56 or something that was called, or 58, whatever it was called. But regardless, this thing is the much cheaper, nasty one, because like the GM30 before it, it was how cheaply can we make a mask? Let's make one like this. So yeah, it's a hollow, desiccated husk of a mask that's totally mummified. Very weird looking thing, not particularly good quality, to say the least. So after recovering from that previous mask, the Hungarians in the Cold War basically decided to do the exact same thing. Let's kind of have a bit of rubber inside the mask and then coat the rubber with cloth material. Now that is the better way to do it, to be honest, coating rubber with a cloth, not the cloth with the rubber. But what you get is this thing. This is the M71, I think it is. I can't actually remember without looking up the name of it. And yeah, I've done a video on this before. It is not a particularly good mask whatsoever. Let's take the dodgy filter off of that and I'll quickly show it you. Because it uses the exact same system to do up, it doesn't make a good face seal. You know, it's just kind of, here's a 3-point sort of strap system. There's actually dust going into my face from putting this mask on. It's in my eye and it's irritating my eye now. Yeah, this thing doesn't make a good seal. I did do a test on this and it kept failing the test no matter how hard I tried. The head harness is very weird. Maybe the head harness isn't quite in my size, but regardless, not comfortable. The straps don't know if they want to sit above your ear or below them, so they're always in the wrong place. Overall, a rather uncomfortable and cheap and horrible mask. Now, what makes this mask even weirder is that Hungary at the time was making PMGs, as far as I'm aware. So they had the sort of factories to make the rubberized Soviet-style masks, so why not make GP5s? But instead they made this thing, which I guess might be even cheaper to make than the GP5, but you know, rather than using cheap Russian design, let's kind of go back to that GM30 design again and then just make it with modern machinery. So there you get the slightly crooked looking mask. The M71 I think it's called, I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah. Not the most expensive mask to make, I guess. now for the Polish M71. I spoke about this recently. It's an even cheaper version of the Czech CM3. It's not really an awful mask or anything, but again, it's like you take a cheap mask and you make it even cheaper to make. So, also this has an MS4 filter with it. People keep saying to me, are MS4 filters safe? No, I personally don't believe so, simply because they're a Warsaw Pact filter from the period when the commies loved shoving asbestos in all their filters. So no, I wouldn't trust, this particular communist filter because it's a communist filter made in a communist country, where they all love shoving asbestos in things. Maybe it is safe, but I wouldn't personally risk it, especially when you can buy Polish FB5 filters now for not very much. So, mask I think was called the Mouse. This was covered in my recent video on Polish gas masks, but yeah, this thing is, like I said, it's not awful. It would definitely protect you. It at least has a Tissot system in this, but it's not a brilliant design. So what I need to do is fully undo the bottom two straps, I think, for how I remember this works. And these are the kind of straps that don't easily pull through all the time. Because let's make the straps as cheap as possible as well. Get that thing on. Now this is really tight, so then we'll do the straps up slightly. There you go, there's this tiny mask stretched onto my face. There's a bit of metal on the exhale valve there that vibrates a bit to act as a pseudo voice diaphragm. Yeah, the mask could actually protect you. Like I said, this is kind of the better end of making a cheap and nasty mask where it isn't awful in every way. But it's still funny that you can get a relatively decent quality but cheap civil mask like the Czech CM3 and then reduce the costs even more and make this thing. The rubber's not as good, the straps aren't as good, the valve assembly isn't as good, but yeah, it would have protected you, so there's always that. But yeah, the Polish MC1 is an example of taking a cheap mask and making it even cheaper. And lastly, the most famous and most mass-produced gas mask in the history of the world, the Soviet GP5 respirator. Basically, let's take our SHM respirator series, shorten the voice, not the voice diaphragm, sorry, the intake and outtake valve to be as cheap as possible, put that on there. Look, now we've made the cheapest gas mask ever made, because it's not necessarily like the lowest quality or anything like that. That's one of the things that people often get wrong about GP5s. They assume they're like bad and horrible masks. What this actually is a fairly decent mask in terms of, how it's built. But it's just the Soviets that became the masters at this point of actually working out how to strip something down to its, bare essential parts to make something as cheap as possible, then setting up all the machinery to mass produce it in massive numbers. So it ends up being even cheaper because of that. 40mm GOST, you all know this mask, it has Tissot tubes. Stretches onto your head. There you have it. The world's most produced mask, made in massive numbers, very cheap, but it's got Tissot tubes. It's not actually particularly uncomfortable, to be honest, as long as you keep your hair short enough it doesn't pull at your hair horribly when you put it on. With a bit of anti-fogging paste on the inside of the lenses, it would at least defog. At least defogs when you breathe in. As I said, very simple. Filter goes on here, exhale valve here. But yeah, probably one of the cheapest masks to ever make, considering the Soviets made apparently about 100 million of them. So there you go, there's my video on super cheap gas masks. Not, as I said, not necessarily cheap for you to buy, but must have been very, very cheap for the countries to make them that made them. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you know any other good examples of really cheap, horrible gas masks, leave me a comment and I'll have a look at them, see if I find them quite funny. But yeah, generally civil defence respirators are made to be as cheap as possible because, civilians aren't as worth as much to you as soldiers. So a lot of them end up being, how can we cut this mask down to the bare minimum to make it? And as said, that doesn't necessarily mean the mask is bad, and from a logistics standpoint it's brilliant being able to mass produce something so at least everybody has a respirator, rather than, the lucky few having respirators. But that doesn't mean that they're particularly, nice and well machined, if that makes sense. The GP5 kind of is, just because of the SHM62U being, you know, the perfect amount of the Soviets cutting everything down and mass producing everything as possible. But still, you know, this video hopefully does demonstrate to you, if you're a country without much budget and you have enough ingenuity, how you can just make everything so ridiculously cheap.